Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my channel, where I like to make audiobooks of various web novels. In this particular series we will be doing Forgotten Dungeon from Royal Road, and in this particular video we will be doing chapters 11 through 15. I hope that you enjoy. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 11. Uno. I gleefully accepted another notification appearing to be the Black Knight was bathed in a magic light. Congratulations! Monster named Jailer Jonathan has been bound to your dungeon. It'll now appear after death and continue to serve you as long as there is enough mana to sustain it. Congratulations! Due to inheriting compatibility, Jailer Jonathan has been made a roaming boss of these rooms, kitchen, food hall, and sparring room. While I was reading through my blue boxes, Jailer simply sat down and chewed on a rock food. I guess years of hunger destroyed whatever semblance of taste that he had before. It looked like food, therefore it was food, and since it wasn't tasting worse than the undead, it was somehow acceptable. My first real boss finished his meal and started wandering around between the rooms as the drones repaired the damage. I also added a bit of my own magic to the location, gleaming bits and pieces from the bounding spell. This was used to make sure that the rock food and assorted items in the kitchen would soon appear again, after I remake them, of course. Still, I felt like a bit kinship towards the strange monster. The system seemed to be very keen on criticizing him, but there were inconsistencies in the analyze to me. He was a non-combatant, a jailer. Why he had to lay down his life in order to save others? On what grounds? And what was the order? So that more important people than him would be saved? This single thing was especially annoying in my intuition. Some of the soldiers escaped, and there was, after all, a mention of betrayal. It seems much more complicated than Analyze painted it to be. I doubted that it was just Jonathan's fault. Strong as he was, it was only compared to my forces. In the grand scheme of things, this amount of power was nothing, because he only had been an AD rank threat. And according to my gaming knowledge, there should be at least S-rank living beings in this world, if not SS and SSS, or even SSS+ or higher. My head hurts thinking about it. If I could only speak to it, but there is not much of the brain left in his head. I have some ideas on how to change that, but it will mean preparing another room, special machines, and of course a large amount of mana. Somehow, I just knew that I was going to be above my current capacity. Somehow, I just knew that I would need to raise my dungeon core level, and again, according to my knowledge, I can do it through killing enemies. Yet I can't really get much done in this essence. Let's call it experience like before, through re-killing the dead. Juicy living beings are needed here, or especially powerful undead beings. That's why, for now, I'll just gather up my forces that I can, so nobody can penetrate my defenses. I don't trust people, generally, and I don't trust people who nuke their planet twice especially. That's for sure. This kind of deed needs a special kind of stupid to commit after all. Back to the topic at hand. Jonathan's story, if I read it correctly, seems like the poor soul was trapped by circumstances and then forced to live his last days in a collapsed dungeon and in the cursed castle, which afterwards resulted in his undeath and compulsion to roam these halls for all of eternity. Not fair at all. Seems like this world is just like that. And that's why we're getting stronger. Electropairs and the Rattling Queen gave me a bit of inspiration. I could get a new weapon made right now. On Earth, they were called electric security batons. Here, I was just going to use the term crackling mace. How one creates such a thing, you may ask? Easily. First, you create a pole made from hardwood. It's important as wood has a low conductivity and will shield the user. After you get one electropair and stick it on the end of the chosen end of the shaft, then one needs to create a nearly filled metal ball and with enough space left for the fruit, and then glue it together using copious amounts of mana duct tape. And done. To tell the truth, that last part was quite draining, and I have only made a few of them because my gas tank bottoms out. So, for now, they're a weapon for the Libra team leaders, tentative name. They're not any different from the compatriots, but they are designated by me as the ones leading other few abominations around. I hope that in the time that they will evolve into something more impressive. Right now, they're just guys with bigger sticks. No leadership qualities whatsoever. Crackling Mace was so easy to use. In addition to simply smacking enemies, which no difference from the earlier designed maces, it also electrocutes anyone stupid enough to get hit. Additionally, I guess inspired by me in turn, the ratlings have already prepared bundles of electro pairs and throw at the enemies, making their first grenades in my dungeon. At least, the cotton cloth and wood are now getting used, both by the ratlings and my production activities. They are just kind of there before. I made a few more pieces of cloth in order to give the ratling craftsmen something to experiment with. Still, I didn't exactly know how they did what they did. Not that it mattered, I had more pressing matters at hand. Mostly the new room that my ingenious ratlings had discovered. One that gave me a really bad vibe. It was the largest of all of them, with a slightly round structure, and there were a lot of sand on the floor, and seeing it through my minion's eyes, only one word came to my mind. Colosseum. Private Kurt the Silent, part of the Waltzer Castle scouting mission. Damn, I knew that something was up with this assignment. The young ranger thought to himself while slowly moving from one obstacle to another, trying to get the most juice from his abilities and inborn dexterity. His lanky frame shifted easily from one broken tree to another, and they were melding into the surroundings. Brown mantle hid Hoody's face and body, while the leather armor and boots worked as a defense. A sleek bow was his main weapon, not counting a dagger stowed away, slightly worn belt. He and 4 other men were chosen to check out the concrete location. For what? No one knew. Discrepancies, whatever that meant, and there were many teams like theirs dispatched along the border. Their guess was this was somehow connected to the popular rumor that there was a new dungeon being born, out there in the Badlands. Just please, please, oh goddess, please, no undead. He pleaded to one of the 3 guardian gods of Vienna. Territories abandoned during the Second Magical War were wild nurseries teeming with decay, daily producing rotten beasts, weird mutations, and other horrors. Yet it was the dead that were the worst counter to his abilities and the most pronounced fear. After all, they could simply sense life force and no range of abilities. Even his 5th level ones were able to stop it. The situation would change if he were a higher level, but alas, he was not. Behind the ranger trailed the rest of his team. Heavy warrior, like all parties, hailing from the Gaynard kingdom. Ranger, 3 warriors, and the paladin, which doubled as a healer. And worst of all was their leader in name, Sergeant Glum, a large, stocky man with a coarse beard, a 2-handed warhammer, and a freaking plate armor. It was only the chest plate, but still. Who takes damn plate armor on a scouting mission? Scolded Kurt in his thoughts, and he was too cowardly to speak up after all. And Glum was a 7th level berserker warrior, which made him a force to be reckoned with. Nobles and their favors. If only the relevant class has sent out here, like maybe a druid, or maybe even a higher level scout. Nope, we send warriors on a scouting mission. How far up their backsides do the higher-ups have their heads? Kurt would have preferred nothing more than to finish his mission and return home, back to the capital. These were idle thoughts, of course, and he still had a tour of duty to complete. 5 more years to be exact, and his position was not a leadership one, so they continued their search. As far as he was concerned, they'd be ready checked enough. Dungeons tended to be created, or seeded as the priests like to call it, in some underground locations, like castles, dungeons, caves, abandoned fortresses, and even house basements. Additionally, they frantically tried to dig towards the surface. It was like an instinct that they couldn't resist. So, as far as he was concerned, since there was no traces of an entrance nearby, it was clear that the rumored dungeon wasn't out here. And what good information too, as Waltzer Castle was one of the locations which mostly infested by undead. I don't even want to think about how much we would have to invest in order to make these lands habitable again. Every living being out here was corrupted by mana, many of the unliving too. And what was worse, these twisted beings were naturally drawn to things which weren't yet pure. And sentience, sadly, were one of them. So were dungeon calls. But the absence of undead, who were clearly drawn somewhere, meant that the scouting team could just do their job and leave. Or at least that would have been the case if our leader wasn't such a gigantic prick. Did you find anything, Lumpy? Asked said prick. Nope, nothing right now, boss, and I think the site is a bust, Ranger answered truthfully. I see. This means the official part of the mission is complete. Kurt held his breath. Here it comes. Read. So we're going to go on a little treasure hunting expedition of our own. Last time Glum said something like that, they retreated after losing a soldier, and she was a good one. So Kurt did the only thing that he could. He protested out loud. That's a bad idea, sir. The undead aren't here, but the only thing that could keep them that occupied for so long are other sentients, and as long as they've finished them off, it'll be our turn. Stow it, elf lover. So what? If trouble comes our way, we'll just run. Glum simply pushed the weak ranger back and continued moving towards the ruins. After a moment, the rest of the warriors followed, shooting him apologetic glances in the process. They at least understood that there was a problem with their leader's thought process. Their group moved forward in a stretched line, searching for treasure amongst the rubble. The once proud castle was now reduced to nothing but dust, and yet there could be some coins amongst them, weapons and sometimes even artifacts. One only had to search deep enough and long enough. Soon the team secured nearly 1/4 of the available ground, and it was also the time when Kurt started noticing that something was wrong. There were a lot of tracks on the ground, and the ones making them were undoubtedly undead. Yet every single one gravitated towards one direction. It was like something with great amount of pure mana was forcing them to go there. Something like a dungeon core. Oh damn, if that's what's going on here, then we need reinforcements now. Who knows how powerful these undead get after gorging on all of that energy. He gulped loudly and stopped walking for a moment, only to hear quite a regular noise. Thump, 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 thump. Sounds of many feet walking in unison. Damn it! The invasion from the Lunar Kingdom? No. They used light troops. Maybe it's the dross or holders. Got us! Then a twang of a bowstring resounded, and Kurt only had a second to react, which he wasted. An arrow hit him in the stomach, forcing the ranger to fall to the ground in an instant. The rest of his team reacted immediately, drawing their weapons and hiding behind their shields. Nobody even thought about saving the young ranger as enemies drew near, skeletons, zombies, and better conserved abominations with their own weapons and arms at the ready. Then a lone figure stepped forward, its skull gleaming in the sun. Humans drew their breaths, hoping against hope. Silently, the undead drew the sword and pointed towards the scouting team. They braced themselves. There was no chance of escape, nor to get reinforcements. Not now. At the fleetest of them had been squirming on the ground, slowly bleeding out. A sword drew in an arc, and the dead army marched forward. Defiant screams of the warriors sounded out, and again, after only, silence remained. And the 5 figures joined the ranks, bodies bloodied and eyes empty. Across the border, many other scouting teams were being slaughtered. In the control center, a surprisingly modern map of the stretch of the officers were coming and going, adding figures to the board and taking them back. Kurt's team was just taken back, their designation given to another unit. And yet the king didn't care one bit about their pawns. End of chapter. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 12. Uno. So yeah, there was the Colosseum around the corner, which seemed like an empty, large space filled with sand. Nothing special beyond this. But it smells to high heavens, according to my gaming instincts. It smells like a trap. Because of that, instead of drilling tunnels towards it, I decided to procrastinate. After all, I was already experienced at such a task, my former life clear proof of it. Taking things for granted, hoping against all odds to keep the status quo, it was the way of life. How many times did I forget about how important tasks, in order to focus on some inane, pedantic errand that I thought was deserving of my attention, like getting the perfect score on each level of FPS, or making sure that my guild was getting the best stuff while doing raids through the night in an MMO. One too many was the answer. But that wasn't a reason to change. It's not like the undead would start digging around to reach my sweet, sweet core, right? Continuing this train of thought, I asked the drones to move towards the hallway and build directly between the food hall and the rattling warrens, and to start tunneling west. There should be enough space out there for what I was planning to do with my scouts. Didn't find enemies' buried rooms that way. As drones toiled under my orders, I could focus on more important tasks, like making weapons, or rather, living weapons. Jonathan was a mouthful, so I decided just to call him by that. Brought into my dungeon 2 very important things. Firstly, his humongous axe, and the second was a functioning, albeit barely, brain. After thoroughly checking both of these items, I decided it was time to create some more minions. Rattlings and levers were not enough in my humble opinion, and my opinion was the only one that mattered down here. This time, I decided to not leave anything to luck. Everything was going through planning. Firstly, 2 large axes similar to Jonathan's were summoned, still made out of pig iron, but what could I do? Each of them sported 2 blades, and one of each side. From what I remembered in games, such weapons were called double-bladed axes. But this was such a mouthful too. In the end, an axe is what I would call them. Simple is the best. Next, I gathered 2 more axes, this time slightly smaller than the 2 even smaller weapons that were made. These, in order, the height, 2 meters, 1 meter, 80 centimeters, and around 50 centimeters. With the tiniest of them, I also made sure to add a few hinges here and there, allowing them to bend their beards? I remember somewhere that is how you were called, the bladed sharp parts. In order to create my newest minion, I forced the metal pole through both axes handles and near the end, far away from the blades, which were going to serve as legs. Then I added 2 slightly shorter weapons in the middle, fitting snugly in between the 2 bigger cousins. Of course, a liberal addition of duct tape was needed, creating a spring-like appendages joining the axe together. Now my contraption would walk, lifting larger blades and smaller ones, like they were terrifying pendulums, and leaving a scar-like pattern on my floor. But nobody was perfect. Between the legs I added as small as the blades, like grasper parts, and then, of course, a space needed for the brain. Right now, it was only a machine with many slashy additions. I was aiming for a monster, though. With a flash of weird spherical thing appeared in my hands. It had a small clockwork sticking away regularly, and a few blinking lights in addition to half-rotten grey mass, lying comfortably in a bowl-like container. The small tentacles around it only twitched when I poked at lazy being. That was the most effective for continuing my experiments. A creation made of a few more or less successful tries, mostly less successful, and I called it a machine. The system had another name prepared. Bile flesh brain contraption. An unholy union of corruption, anima magic, and insane mastery of a mechanical science. It should not live, it should not move, it should not think, and yet it does. This being is one of the first dark machines created by the mad intelligence of a dungeon core. By itself, it doesn't have a lot of strength. However, its unique constitution allows for mental assimilation and control, turning it to a pilot of whatever machine or weapon that it is attached to. Threat level G-. Hey! That was rude. I'm not mad. Or at least, I don't think I am. Nah, who cares? Wasn't there a show on this where they said that normalcy was dictated by the masses? So that means that I am not insane, just different. Unique. Well, yep. Let's continue. The last order of business was fitting the little guy to my prepared machine. As soon as I did, the container sported a few tentacles which secured it in the middle of the moving axis and somehow melded with iron constituting its new body. Did I mention that these weapons were made entirely of iron? No, they were. The machine trembled, resizing a few parts through duct tape magic, and then turned around towards the way from my core room. I had the strangest feeling, wanting to scream, "It lives!" and such. Instead, I just analyzed my new baby. Decapitating engine. Iron machine, made from uniting the bile flesh brain contraption and a suitable body. Due to the type of magic used in its creation, it can slowly regenerate any damage and is immune to the rusting effect. This being has an unhealthy obsession with cutting and decapitating, trying, if possible, to behead its opponents. Its hulking frame and clever construction allows for great speed on flat terrain, but gives it little control over tight turns. Threat level D-. Again, why would the word machine be in quotation marks? It was from especially prepared parts and put together with love and care, and therefore it qualifies with the title of machine, or even the machine. I protest. Una is not amused by your snarkiness, system. It doesn't matter how much I scream and ask for a re-evaluation. This nasty thing makes it clear that the gods of this world disapprove of such inventions. Yet I care not for their approval. It is time to mess around with other things, mostly my ability to create plant-like machines. Yes, machines, not machines, you damn Scrooge. Focus, Uno, focus. In the meantime, my new death machine managed to station itself near the Colosseum tunnel. Somehow, I think that creating a network of tunnels out there would be mandatory. Oh well, I'll take care of it when the need arises. For now, the new room is getting finished. It was a large, and in truth, the largest. It was even bigger than the trap room that I dreaded to uncover. and I was going to fill it with mechanical life. The first thing was to be done was adding my electrical chandeliers onto the ceiling, the source of light that was all must. And these rooms were going to be both deeper and higher than the ordinary ones, 5 meters from the floor to the ceiling in the central point. After preparing the ground for a few of the earlier mentioned axes, I summoned to me and is simply planted with sharp parts to the ground. Green needs to be upwards after all. With a healthy dose of mana, and it grew like a tree. If real trees had small axes falling from the metallic branches and metallic leaves with sharp edges. I also tried another way, putting the blades in the ground. Seeding them was the way to seem to work. A tree created this idea of looking somehow similar to a conifer with a pendulum axis sprouting from the ground and unsuspecting foes. There were also knife bushes which simply grew sharp objects but didn't really do anything with them, in a small acidic flowers which had very delicate stems, breaking under the slightest of touches. And when they did, the surroundings were sprinkled with green, corrosive fluid. Somehow, while pretty much every single one of my creations, the silvery brownish color palette, and the acidic flowers were instead yellow. It would be normal if only the petals were this color, but it was the whole plant. I would understand gold, but piss yellow? Oh well, who cares? At least the anima forced the creation of the acid-sapped abomination that was not without its merits. Lovely, now I have access to acid. And before I even start the acid traps, there is one very important thing that it was used in. That is, the batteries. The room I was putting all of these mechanical plants into was a little bare, and all this hardship for no gain. I could be a dick and just do that, but my own creations seemed to thrive in the interaction between the dungeon inhabitants. So why not create a little teeny-weeny battery to put in the ground at the end of this place? What's the worst thing that could happen? Then I sprinkle some mana and some anima for good measure, and the image of a really important before, so it should be the same right now. Then, wait a minute, maybe 5, and what happens? Oh, that. Battery Devourer. Greenish machine plant was created with an idea to preserve energy in mind. In its own twisted way, it fulfills that function. This dark machine initially looks like a small, weak tree with strange cylinders looking like fruits growing on its branches, and it can thrive in absorbing ambient mana, both corrupted and pure variants, and be used to create items that will work in a similar way. The plant itself, however, prefers to attack and digest living beings by using and draining abilities and the tentacle roots normally hidden underground. Threat level E++. Really? Really, system? This is a machine, according to you? End of chapter. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 13. My conservatory was complete without a hitch. I wasn't calling the room a greenhouse, since there wasn't much green inside. At least the plants were now finished. New monsters put safely in their positions, but that also meant that there wasn't anything to do. Well, except for digging and making new rooms, and that grew boring extremely fast. I craved the excitement of a fight, even if it would wipe me out of existence. Normally, I was just a coward, but the battles in my dungeon didn't feel real, not counting that time when I nearly had my core grabbed and devoured. But we don't talk about that. The vibe was getting was even more in the vein of a reality show, with all of my cameras focused in the action of real life. Were the feelings are categorized as a dungeon core, instincts, or maybe something else entirely? It didn't really matter. I could hide in my shell and produce more and more monsters while digging room after room, but there was no purpose behind it. I wanted a sentient to walk into my halls and exclaim in wonder and fear, and then preferably get mauled to death. Okay, I admit it. Part of the reason that I was so impatient was the fact that this limit that I was steadily approaching. My current dungeon core level was 0, and I was somehow made accurately aware that I could only dig a few more rooms or create 1 or 2 more monsters, and it was simply slipped out of my control. And yet digging into existing spaces was considered okay. Some sort of loophole? I couldn't care less, but like any real gamer, I was eager to exploit it. This made the Colosseum a viable choice, even if it was a trap. So no more hesitation. There is no time like the present. Let's do it. I clenched my non-existent teeth, trying to force the outcome, and asked both Jonathan and the Decapitator, decapitation engine as per the system's naming, which sounded just droll, to move towards the drone starting the working. And waited. Just like half of my new life was waiting. Thankfully, my minions finished their job only in a few minutes. Breaking through the subsoil was easy after all. Slowly, a small tunnel appeared, only to end the metal bars recessed in the floor. Talk about disappointing. The next order was to cut them down, but seeing as both the cutting tools and the barrier were made from the same material, it would take some time. So during this unexpected break, I ordered the rest of the drones to start working towards another goal. I had the strange idea of creating a few twisting tunnels leading towards the R.E. I was aiming for a place a bit smaller than the one in the Dark Souls games, where a strange circular undead roamed with impudence. And my little corner of the deadly roads would be, instead, a home ground of the Decapitator, which should be less scary. Also, 2 bosses on 1 floor should be enough. Now that I think about it, how would I even decapitate things? Weren't they pretty much all of the blades vertical? Talk about not being able to satisfy one's craving. Did I do a great disservice? Let's behave like I didn't notice at all. Maybe the problem will go away on its own. Whatever happens, happens. Anyway, it took the drones a few hours to make sure that the tunnel network was completed, according to my plan. In the meantime, the Ratlings also managed to dig out some of the outposts and roads of their own, and in turn, my dungeon was getting even more chaotic. While I could feel where the entrances and exits were, as a 3D model of them was looking more and more like soggy spaghetti. On the bright side, if even I wasn't able to map them out, then the enemies trying to do so unintentionally were screwed over. Which was still lovely. I wasn't going to ask why the Ratlings were moving small electropairs in there and masking the scouting tunnels with knife bushes. They're the only plant life out there. You're not hiding anything. At least the obsession with the acidic flowers was easy to understand, especially after a few of them were nearly melted when searching through the conservatory for the first time. I didn't check how the plants propagated too. Another time. For now, my drones are nearly finished with their task. It was time to advance. Metal bars screamed for the last time until their tools cleared the way forward. The room seemed serene and silent. First, a team of Libras walked forward, close to each other, somehow holding a defensive formation with their leader sporting a crackling mace. Just behind that group was the Rattling warriors waltzed in, not planning at all to advance my guard. They moved cautiously, sniffing the air and pointing their spears towards suspicious parts of the room. And this Colosseum was suspicious as hell. For one, there were still torches burning, underground, in a room closed off for years. I wasn't even going to start on how the oxygen in there would be burned up long ago. That's because the answer was boring. Magic, obviously. The question was, who was prideful enough and powerful enough to keep them burning through the years? The answer came quickly as a shadow pounced from the ceiling on the Libra walking to the front. The abomination was totally surprised, but quiet, which reminded me once again to at least give them mouths, and maybe a pump to allow them scream. Or a creepy wheezing. Anyways, my minions just tumbled on the sand, rising dust clouds and dispersing, trying to free itself. To no avail though, the assailant stood up quickly and twisted off its head like it was a beer cap. At this moment, I took a good look at it. Clearly a humanoid shape, rag-like clothing, which was probably finery of some sort, covering a wrinkled, scarred skin, which made the being look like a dried-up mummy. I fired Analyze, and as soon as it stopped. Bloodless vampire spawn. Vampires are beings of darkness, a type of undead that thrive on blood of the living creatures. It is because of that trait that they are fiercely trying to preserve sentient races that the Badlands creatures seek to consume. They are nonetheless hunted by sapiens and eradicated without quarter. Most of the monsters classified as vampires have a robust physique, great night vision, powerful regeneration, and the ability to create more of their kind by sharing their blood. One becomes a vampire through such a ritual or by way of a curse. This being was turned from a sentient, which makes it weaker and progenitor of an additional of lack of blood and experienced through the years. Because of the inability to die and lack of life-giving liquid through the years, it is turned utterly insane. There is only thirst in its mind. Threat level D. Like an overture to my reading, the vampire just found out that there was no blood in my Libra, and it threw the severed head at the other warriors and screamed at them. There were clearly words, but just like I thought, no language cheat for me. I was, after all, just a little dungeon crawl, not an isekai hero sent to right wrongs. Who cares? Capture it alive if you can, I whispered to my monsters, and they surged forward like a wave of metal and death, flesh closing in on the enemy. Except for the ratlings. They instead decided that it was time to add some skewering to the menu. The spears flew forward in a silent command, impacting the vampire through the chest and the left arm, but not slowing it down in the slightest. It crunched and made itself smaller target, and sprinted towards the meat shields. The claws on its hands looked every bit as dangerous, I admit it. The first lever trying to stop it went flying. The second didn't fare much better, but it gave one of the crackling maces away to bash the vampire's face, and one smack but only laughed in response. And then the lightning hit, scorching the wrinkly face and actually lighting it on fire. The laugh turned into a scream, and as it tried to claw out the pieces of flesh, it still stuck to its skull. That's when Jonathan started running into the middle of the chaos, taking advantage of the distraction. Well, maybe not exactly running, but there was a tottering grace to his movements. Something about a comically imbalanced being trying to walk on its toes. The axe he sported was not funny at all, though. And neither was the big screw-you swing that nearly cleaved the creature in half, taking both arms and digging a scar across the middle of its chest. The vampire crumbled down immediately, ceasing resistance. It still tried to move, but the damage was simply too great. If it had hit points, it would have been left with 1 or 2. Alive! Take it alive, I screamed in anger, making most of the creatures twitch. Jonathan only stared at his feet, like a small child chided by its parent. I sighed. At least there's hope, and the vampire regeneration wasn't overrated. It did survive here for years, and that was mostly because it couldn't die even if it wanted to. Just take the pieces, put them together, and make sure it won't escape. My orders were carried out swiftly for once, with only the ratlings instead searching the whole room. What they found were bones, hundreds of bones, humanoid, women, men, children, horses, or something that looked similar enough, sheep, dogs, cats, also 1 or 2 cows, and then goats, weird snake-like things. There was even a skeleton of a gorilla. A monkey, anyhow. And all of them seemed to be drained of blood, with many, and I mean many, holes, similar to the fangs slightly jutting out of the vampire's upper jaw. Their remaining skin was punctured and broken in many places, but there is something in horror seen just before death that stays with one's body, even if its only dissected husks remain. Somehow, I could easily imagine the tragedy that happened here, but it didn't matter anyway. What mattered, though, was the existence of the broken-down stairway leading upper and lower levels. The rest of the room was just like it looked from the outside. The whole lot of nothing. Sand and 4 now extinguished torches. I planted my chandeliers at once, brightening the space in a white and totally different from the blood-red color that had basked in before. I already knew what I wanted to do. The order was given, and the drones slowly started to force their way upwards. And I returned to my core room, where the new guest was getting moved. It was time for some literal mind-buggery. End of chapter. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 14. Uno. There was an idea bouncing around in my head ever since I started using wires and all the pseudoscience stuff. And of course, mana duct tape to bind things that normally wouldn't work together. But if I could use them on a living creature, what would happen? Would it become one of the dungeon monsters? Or maybe it would get something else out of it? Or it would just expire? In a more or less gory fashion? That's why I was glad that my first subject in that matter was pretty much immortal, as long as I won't press too much with my experiments. I know that because during these few minutes the vamp pretty much reattached its arms. And the damage to its chest was pretty much gone too. Perfect. In the meantime, out of pig iron I created an operating chair and added restraints, one that wouldn't be out of place in a horror movie. This, however, was the reality. My creature dragged the vampire and forced it into the chair. It was looking around wildly, trying to get it free from the dungeon core's boss, was looking it over, or rather him. By this time, it was quite clear that my subject was a male. The fear visible in his eyes, and it didn't deter me in the slightest. His fate was already decided. From my camera network I started to grow sharp copper wires, which slowly slithered their way into the prisoner. They looked like animals stalking its prey, metal glistening into the light as they slowly grew closer and closer. The vampire started whimpering, doubling his efforts to escape. It was futile. I already tested the restraints against my much stronger beings. Jonathan was not amused. In a while, the wires were coiled around his neck, preparing for the vertebra insertion. After all, breaking the skull was much too of a task, so I opted sliding it into the spinal column and only then the brain. And then it happened. The sharp metal made an incision, slithering inside like a parasite. Through my magic, I could see the wires slowly and painfully making their way towards the brain, and then piercing it. The vampire winced in pain every time the wire moved. And then it started screaming loudly, yanking his restraints in panic, his voice contained in my courtroom behind closed doors. In a few minutes, the sound level fell down to the earlier whimpering, and at that time, the wires were in place. Now for my experimentation. I added electricity to the network, eliciting another scream from my patient. Good, the connection is now working. Right now, however, it is nothing more than a meat puppet. With a bit of work, I could probably even move it around, but that wasn't the reason I was experimenting. No, I needed knowledge about the world, about the races and kingdoms here, and most importantly about the language. My ability to think and gather information were all of the greatest surprises for the invading sapiens. These strange gods admitted it themselves. None of the dungeon calls were intelligent. If I was found out as an outlier, perish the thought, but still, there was a non-zero chance that I would be slaughtered immediately. After all, the rest of the calls were nothing more than cattle for the sapiens to harvest. With this, I had a moral superiority to make them cattle too. Just kidding, I didn't care either way. Anyone going into my halls surrenders their lives. In Uno country, it's Uno rules. I don't care about the moral dilemma for now. The wires were in place, and it was time to try. Or for new knowledge. Still, there was about 100 billion neurons in the sapient brain. Somehow, I think this will be a long night. Or a few. I sent the anima towards one of them and pushed, and the vampire screamed in pain, and then nothing. Not this one, huh? Cross it out, and let's check the next one. Scream, nope, again. Rika, Lunar Kingdom Scout. I crawled forward with caution, trying to hide between the sickly-looking shrubbery growing near the ruins of Walser Castle. There was a stench of death in the air, and I wasn't one to recklessly charge forward, even if our priest said that something was stirring in these parts. More importantly, I saw the marks of a scuffle that some poor fools from the Gaynard Kingdom left. Trails of holy light and wide swings of two-handed weapons marking the stone were easy to understand, but I wasn't going to end like that. Be careful, I used hand signals to warn Beno, my druid partner, that something was amiss. He nodded and growled quietly, he and his familiar Leaf hiding nearby. I wasn't a druid like him, but there was always a slight sense of unease. He loved to stay in this form for too long for it to be healthy. Not to mention that both his form and his female familiar, were Dark Panther race, which led to some unsavory comments. At least he was competent, not like most of the people that I was paired with earlier. We were retreating. I signaled, and our forms slowly retreated towards the temporary camp that we'd made 15 minutes earlier. And we went back without any trouble, and soon we were sitting near the small smokeless campfire and eating field rations. Beno even turned back to his human form. He's 2 meters, muscular, and radiating wildness. He devoured the food with large gulps while keeping watchful eyes on the surroundings. Wearing his half-prepared animal skins made him look like a real barbarian. Don't keep me in suspense, Rika. What happened out there? He asked in the end. Looking at the brooding half-elf, the ranger turned his childish face towards the druid and mumbled under his breath. Damn undead happened, that's what. The Gaynard scouting team was wiped out nearby. All newbies, you know. I saw enough marks to be sure of their nationality, and at least they had a ranger with them. Yet Goddess of Luck wasn't favoring them, he confessed slowly. I don't understand why they're doing this. Wasn't sending a low-level team into this wilderness pretty much a suicide mission? Why waste manpower like that? They don't have a choice, you know, Rika sighed. Unlike us, their population is booming. Their farmlands are taken over by the Blight or being burned by the warring nobles. The Gaynard Kingdom is starving, Beno. They're just getting rid of excess people. It's still a waste, you know. I think so too, but their choices are limited. He sent a small prayer to Mirabella. They are a warrior-centric country, not like our druids, who can even cleanse the corruption. He nodded towards the large man. Ha ha! Of course! And they instead opted for the saturation technique. Saturation? They feed low-level parties to the undead, and the undead grow stronger, and then they send in high-level warriors who can do much more good in the long run and wipe out the whole infestation. A small half-elf face clouded. "That's inhuman," the druid shouted quietly, and he knew that any large display of emotion was stupid. They were still in enemy lands after all, but there was a rage burning in his eyes. Yet, it works. That's why the kingdom worships mostly the god of science and stars, for the greater good, as they say. Still, don't worry about it, old friend. It's not like we can do anything about it. We're not heroes after all. And the small, twisted face in an angry expression. Yet any woman who saw him at the moment would squeal in delight and race to pamper him. Quite the humiliation for a man in his 40s. Curse the half-elf heritage that he called. Let's move out. There is one more place that we need to check. And if I'm right, we're going to retreat and return to the reinforcements. Yep, let's go. The giant answered, immediately transforming into a dark panther. Its taut muscles moving under his skin. From the outside of the camp, Leaf appeared, snuggling against him. The ranger nodded while moving forward quietly, trying to blend into the surroundings. They already packed all that they needed for a quick retreat. Undead were after all adept at sensing living. 20 minutes later, they were back at the ruins. Dark pieces of stone covered in sickly vegetation were strewn about the ground, leaving little to the imagination. There was a distinct lack of undead, which tingled Ricker's senses a lot. Be careful, very careful. He signaled to the panther and growled in assent. It took another few minutes until the ranger managed to spot their enemies. Sadly, they were spotted in return. Straightening his back, Ricker hissed in annoyance. "Death, General! Crap! I knew it! We need to gather an expedition before it manages to accrue more subordinates." As if in response to his speech, the undead started moving towards them in a tight formation. They were skirmishers closing in too quickly. He clicked his teeth. "Let's run, Bino. We need to report back immediately." The Dark Panther howled while swiping at the nearby undead, taking off its head. Leaf bit another one and recoiled in disgust, growling at the sight of incoming zombies and skeletons. The whole group started running, leaving their enemies in the dust. When they left, the surrounding Death General ordered the troops to stand down. Its eyeless skull moved towards the direction that the rangers, and then he buried a staircase nearby. It shook its head and with a human-like fashion, and then it simply continued to wait. Uno. Stick, scream, stick, scream. I'm growing bored. I have no sadistic streak after all. Just doing what I need to get done. But it's slowly becoming too much, even for me. Stick, scream, stick. Oh, did it work? It worked! I screamed through the dungeon link, and my creatures hooted in response, levers smacking their clubs on the ground and rattlings dancing around. I returned to my quorum. "So, your name is Daniel?" "No, that's not right." "Daniel, yes, good. It seems like I can start in earnest now." End of chapter. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 15. Uno. Daniel's interrogation proved to be informative, if unnerving. In the middle of the process, I became very aware of the method of gathering information leaves large parts of his brain unusable. Burned out of existence. With the vampire in question, it wasn't a big problem, since his regeneration kicked in and almost immediately. But the data contained within these regrown neurons was simply gone. After all, it was like an electronically stored information. Put a magnet near a hard drive, give it a few minutes, and the contents go poof. Wait, didn't that mean that the brain was just like a more complicated computer? And with my power over electricity, also magnets? How was it that I didn't think about them earlier? Well, it's not like they're that useful, seeing that most of my creations have iron content. But still, this venue of thought was worth pursuing in the long run. Just not now. Because right now I was being overwhelmed with information. Or rather, fragments of what way was being presented. All because Daniel continued to turn more and more insane with each passing moment. Yet there was a little that I was able to do in order to salvage his mind. Like some kind of defense mechanism, his ego fractured into emotionally unstable places. There were anger, fear, sadness, but also happiness, dutifulness, and even a lust for revenge. Most pieces actively worked against each other, turning the whole ordeal into a race against time. So I was asking and discontent choir and answered, sometimes distorting the information and sometimes giving different answers altogether. It didn't help that I was assessing these knowledge was about 100 years old. Or more, or less. It could be 50, and it could be 200, too. I was no forensic detective, after all. The most I could tell about the state of the bodies found in the Colosseum was that they were dead, and for a long time. Anyways, what mattered was the high possibility that any information gained by his brain was massively outdated. Yet beggars can't be choosers. Because of that, I focused on things that could be relatively unchanged even though the years had passed. For one, I copied Daniel's knowledge of the language in its entirety. That also included some arithmetic and logic, with the alphabet and full encyclopedia. I also breathed a sigh of relief. The locals used a decimal system, and the writing type somehow resembled the Western alphabet system that I was used to when I was alive. In his brain, there were also knowledge about the current or past state of the world, and boy, it wasn't pretty. It covered what the gods had already told me, about 2 magical wars, the destruction and slow decay of the civilized lands, how most of the gods left the world, and how people felt despair, worshipping demons and false idols, about necromancers, blood mages, and cannibals who conquered parts of the known world, and how Brighton, Mirabella, and Gangria stabilized the dying world, consolidating the power of the sentients into the remaining countries, forging them like living metal while managing scientific and cultural progress. There were parts about the Hron Continent that my dungeon was located in, and mentions of 2 other landmasses located somewhere on the west. No idea about the state that they were in, though. The first time in the planet I knew about the outside, or at least part of it, even if it was a piece of book knowledge. Hron Continent shape reminded me of the nearly fallen over pear, with the smaller part being in the air and lower simply melt into an unrecognizable mess. I was located in the upper part, near the Gaynard Kingdom, where battles against the Badlands and their creatures were a common occurrence. The kingdom's population was mainly composed of humans and a small amounts of other races. Their army prided themselves with heavy infantry troops and fire mages while worshipping Brighton, the god of science. The west was the Lunar Kingdom, blessed by Mirabella, boasting a large half-elf population, while cultivating long-lasting hatred with the southern Elven theocracy, backed by the Gangria, goddess of nature. True to their name, the elves took pride in their ancestry and innate magic, strong enough to hold the line against the longest southern border alone. The east was the Gaynard Kingdom stood the dwarven holds, entrenched in the deep mountains and fighting their own battles with the undead and monsters. There was a lot of blood being spilled in the tunnels deep below the earth. The dwarves usually kept to themselves, but as long as nothing catastrophic happened to their underground cities, they had the best chance to survive amongst the nations of Yana. And then, even further east, sticking to the nearby sea nested the Dross Republic, a nation of builders and explorers madly interested in creating fortresses and expanding their naval force. Their holographic rulers didn't discriminate against non-human races and tended to focus heavily on the mercenaries and pike squares, not stopping even at purchasing the services of the Badland barbarians. What shook me most was something else. Why? Well, there were only 5 nations on this continent. Surely their lands ought to be enormous, right? Wrong. Well, not counting the Elven theocracy lands, which seemed to seep like blood out on the wound, creeping on an uneven line of forest and living castles. It seems like their warriors, are well versed in jungle warfare, had an upper hand, but in the end they were too stretched thin, like the other countries. All these nations seemed to be amateur attempts to create war machines capable of wiping out the enemies with ease, yet no one of them seemed to be sustainable. The Gaynard Kingdom, for instance, was a firm believer in the scorched earth policy. They even had whole noble families dedicated to the task. Casting such humongous spells seemed to demand large quantities of mana and time. In order to provide the latter, heavy armored troops became a staple of their armies. And also, I couldn't forget that there are famed blade masters, warriors who were rumored to be capable of wiping out armies just by themselves. I shuddered. If these powerful guys were the shields of civilization, I wondered what the hammer was striking down it. And the clock was ticking. Besides the more general knowledge, I was able to understand a bit about the common sense of sapiens, especially those who lived in the nearby Gaynard Kingdom. It was very similar to what I read about in the Middle Ages, a medieval caste system, where nobles were treated like different beings. Except here there was also new magic, and the lowly masses were illiterate, superstitious, and always hungry and poor. The omnipresent suspicion and distrust of both magic and unknown were like an illness stopping the development of this nation that's supposedly blessed by the god of science. It was a nightmare who produced both mindless soldiers and zealous mages while mutilating souls of anyone stupid enough to care into the parts of the war machine. I didn't care. The only information that was important here was the surety that there would be no end to the young, over-ambitious fools trying to get richer and stronger in my halls. They'd change their destiny. Most of them would die in the process, feeding me. More importantly, there was also bad news I discovered when shifting through Daniel's brain for the dungeon knowledge. Like the fact that the moment that I let my drones break to the surface, all the accumulated mana will scoot out and like a fountain, and in turn it will convert the surrounding lands to my element and affinity, which was anima and electricity? Yeah, that won't backfire at all. Crap. Who knows what'll happen? The electricity wasn't bad on its own. Maybe the mountainous region and the sharp peaks and even sharper winds could be created on a large hill with a high iron content, capable of drawing down the ire of lightning. It was an inclusion of Anim Element that worried me immensely. This inner truth that it was supposed to exert on the surroundings. What will happen? Who the hell knows? But there was no question about it. Striking the surface would draw all kinds of attentions, both good and bad. And there was another thing that I was made aware of. It seemed like in the past the sentients tried to immediately send parties to the new dungeon. Explorers tended to be either hot-headed youths or old, powerful adventurers. The first type served as living bait, judging the quality and danger level of the dungeon. The second type duty was more sinister. They delved in order to challenge the intelligence behind the dungeon and enslave it. Yep, enslaving it. There was a whole branch of magics prepared just to make sure that it produced the sentient population needed at the moment and it wasn't able to oppress its new masters. This also included a permanent outpost carved into the core room. Yeah, hell no. It wasn't going to wait for some overpowered mother duffer to collar me and then be forced to live the rest of my days like a fricking cattle. The excavation was stopped immediately, the drones buckling under my anger. I shouted mentally, feeling my minions once again rage in their own way. The whole place was a part of me, and I'll be damned if some entitled adventurers tries to get their grubby hands in it. Ugh, no. Calm down. Calm down. Calm, you know. I needed to be calm. It was, after all, time to plan, to counteract and preferably to fool these sentients while still being regarded as a simple dungeon. Maybe not one easy, but not an intelligent, devious being. What cards did I have in my hand? Prawns for one, and they didn't count against my creature limit as such and could be put nearly everywhere, as long as there was space. Most of my tunnels were looking a bit barren, not counting the conservatory, of course. It was time to change this. My invisible form flashed through every room, adding a few knife bushes here and there to generate better ambience. The mental list of plants wasn't really that impressive at the moment. Besides the knife bushes, I had two types of trees, which are called axe conifer and the silver ironbark, and the acid plant fiery dandelion, which exploded on contact. Not enough. For now, something to hide my creature's grass. Of course, an ordinary thing would be too boring, not even to mention dead at the moment. It was born. Instead, I gathered the pieces of copper, stretched it thin, and planted it in the soil of my dungeon. It grew nearly immediately, leaving me with a strange, spring-like plant with the only unusual ability was that it was bounced back and pressed on the ground. The copper grass was simple enough to name for it. After that, I used bone, just a generic one, and after pouring anima inside it, I created a fern-like plant with pale white leaves, also not dangerous, but thick enough to hide something under it. A bone fern was enough for it. And for that something, I used both the bone and iron, creating a liana that bulbous roots reacted to movement. The reaction was simple, to catch and strangle, and it could grow both on the floor and on the ceiling, and even on the walls. I propagated it through the dungeon and decided to call it a strangleroot in the future. And then there was one more thing to focus on. In nature, there were types of lichens that would extract water from the air. Using my anima, focused on the intent and summoned a bone, making it grow on the closest wall and lose its white color. Something forcing it to look more like a metallic, like most things in my dungeon. It turned and twisted, growing more porous, and even formed a few tubes with which water could be stored. When it was done, bone lichen, the living silver, was claiming the walls everywhere, and it would serve as a good enough plant to keep my other flora from rusting. Not that I was sure that they needed it at all. There was now remained two things to do: hiding my core and making sure that Daniel was stowed away. And then I'll just have to face the odds. End of chapter. And that concludes today's episode of The Forgotten Dungeon. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so, all of which are listed below. But the easiest way would be to collect forgotten souls, create new dungeons, and force them to like and subscribe my videos. Alright, I hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you all in the next video.